Welcome, and thank you for joining The Sleepless Night. Before we begin our journey into the past, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your blankets, let your breath soften, and allow the world around you to grow a little quieter. If you're enjoying these nightly travels through history, feel free to tap the like button or subscribe so you never miss a new tale. And if you'd like to share, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time your story begins. It's always peaceful to imagine this little community stretching across time zones, each of us drifting off to the same gentle rhythms of the past. Now, let the weight of the day slip away. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your thoughts slow. And when you're ready, we'll step softly into tonight's story. On nights when the wind drifts softly across the fjords of Norway, there is a story the old tales still whisper. A story of a man whose life stretched across kingdoms, across empires, and across the ancient world, like the long shadow of a mountain at dusk. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, though history would remember him by another name. Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, the last great Viking. His life was not the life of a quiet man. It was a life of exile and adventure, of battles fought far from home, of treasure earned and kingdoms claimed. And yet, tonight, his story comes to you not as a clash of swords, but as a gentle wandering through time, a soft lantern carried down the long halls of memory. As you listen, allow the world around you to fall away. Let the sound of distant waves fill the edges of your mind. Let the crackle of a small fire warm the dark. And let the past open slowly, like a book with pages worn smooth by many hands. This is the story of Harald Hardrada, the knight who refused to die, the king who crossed continents, the last echo of the Viking Age. Now, settle in, and let us begin where every great story begins, with the world that shaped him. Long before Harald Hardrada became a name known across Europe, long before he sailed to distant lands or stood in gleaming armor beneath the sun of Byzantium, he was simply Harald, a boy born into a land of cold mornings, steep mountains, and long winters that softened only under the brief kindness of summer. Harald entered the world around the year 1015, a time when Norway was still finding its shape. It was a kingdom in name, yes, but not always in practice. The mountains divided people as surely as the sea connected them. Farms clung to the edges of fjords like small lanterns scattered across a vast and quiet dark. Villages were close-knit, held together by shared work, shared food, and shared stories told during winter nights. In these villages, the sagas lived. Children grew up listening to tales of Odin and Thor, of heroes who crossed oceans in longships carved with the heads of dragons. For young Harald, these stories were not distant myths. They were the air he breathed, the thread that tied him to the past. His family was not an ordinary one. Harald was the youngest half-brother of Olaf Haraldsson, the man who would one day be known as Saint Olaf, King of Norway. Olaf was strong-willed, ambitious, and determined to bring the scattered lands under a single rule. A rule rooted in Christianity, which was still new to much of the population. Many accepted it, some resisted, and Harald, even in childhood, lived in the tension between the old world and the new. Norway at the time was a land of shifting alliances. Chieftains held local power. Kings came and went, each trying to shape the land in their own way. But Harald's family, bold, stubborn, and determined, believed they had a divine claim to rule. And so Harald grew up not only surrounded by sweeping natural beauty, but by a sense of destiny. The quiet understanding that his family stood at the center of a great turning tide. Imagine Harald as a boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing at the edge of a frozen lake while the evening sky turns shades of violet and pale blue. He would have learned to handle a shield almost as soon as he could walk. He would have been taught to read the weather by watching the clouds move across the mountains. He would have heard the creaking of ships in the harbor and the low murmur of men preparing for journeys across the sea. Life for Harald was not gentle, but it was full of expectation, full of training, full of stories waiting to become real. His older brother Olaf saw something in him, some spark of strength or courage, or perhaps simply stubbornness. Olaf was already gathering followers, already shaping his claim for the throne, and Harald, wide-eyed and eager, followed his brother like a young wolf learning the paths of the forest. But history is never simple, and the road to power in the north was tangled with conflict. As Harald approached adolescence, Norway erupted into a struggle for the crown that would change the shape of his life forever. The battle that followed would be one of the most famous in Norwegian history, a battle that every child in the north heard about for centuries afterward, a battle where kings were made and where they fell. And Harald, only 15 years old, would stand at the heart of it. But before we reach that moment, take a slow breath. Let the landscape settle in your mind. Steep cliffs rising from deep water, forests whispering in the wind, and a young boy sharpening the edge of a sword far too large for his hands. For this was the world that formed him, a world that would send him down a path no one could have imagined, a path toward exile, toward distant empires, toward glory, and toward a destiny written in steel. By the summer of the year 1030, Harald Hardrada stood on the edge of his first great turning point. He was still just a boy, 15, perhaps 16, but in the north, childhood often ended early. The world around him was shifting like ice breaking on a river, and the tides of history were already pulling him forward. His brother, Olaf Haraldsson, had returned from exile. Olaf had once been king of Norway, but powerful chieftains, supported quietly by the Danish, had driven him out. Now he sought to reclaim the throne, to bind the country together under one crown, and to strengthen the Christian faith that had taken root but not yet flourished. But he did not return alone. He came back with loyal followers, with warriors who remembered his rule, with those who believed he was rightful king, and among them, watching with sharp young eyes, was Harald. Imagine the scene. A column of men walking through the summer countryside, shields slung across their backs, spears catching the light, horses moving steadily along narrow paths. The air smelled of pine and warm earth. Birdsong drifted from the treetops, and overhead, the long northern day stretched endlessly, as if refusing to let the sun set on what was to come. Harald marched at his brother's side, learning with every step. He watched how Olaf spoke to the men, with confidence, with conviction, how he kept their spirits steady when the journey grew long. These were lessons Harald would carry with him all his life. Yet beneath that calm, a storm was gathering. Those who opposed Olaf were not idle. Chieftains, farmers, and powerful families had banded together to keep him from regaining the throne. To them, Olaf was too strong, too forceful, too unwilling to bend. Some still clung to the old gods and saw him as a threat to their way of life. Others simply believed he would bring war and hardship. And so armies began to gather at a place called Stiklestad. It was a broad valley surrounded by gentle hills, with fields of ripening grain and farmsteads scattered across the landscape. A quiet place under normal circumstances. But on that day, it became the stage for one of the most remembered battles in Norwegian history. As Olaf's men approached, the sky hung low with grey clouds. The air felt heavy, as though it understood what was about to happen. Harald, barely grown, tightened his grip on his spear. He could hear the murmurs of the older warriors, some steady, some uneasy. The opposing army outnumbered them, heavily. Local farmers had joined the chieftains, forming a force far larger than Olaf's band of loyalists. But numbers were not everything. Harald watched his brother lift his chin, unafraid. Courage has a way of igniting courage. When the two sides finally met in the valley, they formed shield walls, rows of overlapping shields, men standing shoulder to shoulder. The sound of shields locking together echoed across the field like distant thunder. In most tellings of the battle, this is where the noise erupts, the clash of iron, the cries of warriors, the charge. But tonight, we approach it gently. Imagine instead the quiet moment before the first advance, when everything grows still. The wind holds its breath. The valley falls silent. And a young Harald looks forward, heart pounding, feeling the weight of destiny settle onto his shoulders. When Olaf gave the command, his men stepped forward as one, slowly at first, then with more force, their boots sinking into the soft earth, shields pressed together, spears angled outward. Harald moved with them, the rhythm of the march humming through his bones. He was small compared to the older warriors, but he was agile, quick, and fierce. He had trained for this moment, though no training can ever fully prepare a person for their first battle. The shield walls collided with a deep, resonant thud, like two waves crashing together. Push met push, weight met weight. Harald found himself pressed between the men beside him, using his shoulder, his legs, every ounce of strength to hold the line. The world narrowed to the space in front of his shield. He saw flashes of metal, heard the dull scrape of wood, felt the tremor of each impact. Yet through the chaos, he kept moving forward. This was the moment when his childhood truly ended. When he proved not only to others, but to himself, that he could stand in the heart of danger. The battle lasted for hours, hard, grueling hours. Men fell on both sides. The shield walls broke and reformed, surged and rolled like storm waves across a rocky shore. And then came the moment that would echo through the ages. King Olaf fell. How he died is told in many ways. Some say he was struck down by 3 men at once, others that his wounds were blessed and marked him for sainthood. But for Harald, what mattered was the sight of his brother disappearing into the crush of bodies, and the knowledge that the battle was lost. In that instant, the world shifted again. Harald fought fiercely. Some say he fought like a young bear, refusing to retreat until he was forced from the field. But even his determination could not change what had happened. As the opposing army closed in, Harald was wounded. An arrow or spear, accounts differ, struck him in the leg. He could no longer stand. And so, in the smoke and confusion of retreat, 2 loyal warriors lifted him and carried him from the valley. He left Stiklestad not as a boy following his brother, but as a young warrior who had seen the cost of ambition faith, and power. He left the field knowing that Norway had changed forever. Olaf was gone, and he was now a fugitive. Harald's wound throbbed as they took him north towards safety. The air grew cooler. The forests closed around them, and with every mile, the world of his childhood slipped away. Ahead lay exile, uncertainty, and a long, winding road that would lead him farther from home than he ever imagined. But for now, for this quiet moment, he rested. A young man carried from a battlefield, staring at the sky above the trees, wondering what path life would take him next. And that path would soon lead him into the east, into the courts of princes, the markets of Kiev, and eventually toward the greatest empire of the medieval world. In the quiet days after Stiklestad, the world seemed to fold in around Harald Hardrada. The once bright hopes of reclaiming Norway had dimmed with the setting sun of the battlefield, leaving only grief, uncertainty, and the long shadow of defeat. Harald, wounded and weary, was carried north through valleys and forests by the few loyal companions who remained by his side. The land itself felt changed. Fields that once hummed with summer life now stretched silently beneath a grey sky. Villagers kept their distance, unsure of whether to offer shelter or stay hidden. Word of Olaf's death had already begun to spread, moving through the countryside like a shifting wind. And with it came danger, for those loyal to the fallen king were no longer welcome. Harald's leg ached with every movement, but the pain was something he learned to fold away, like a stone held in a pocket, familiar and unavoidable. Though still barely more than a youth, he understood that returning home was impossible. The men who now controlled Norway would not hesitate to end the life of Olaf's younger brother. And so, with the soft certainty of one standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, Harald made a choice. He would flee the land of his birth. Not forever, but long enough to grow stronger, wiser, and powerful enough to return. He and his small band of followers set their sights eastward. The journey carried them first into the deep forested regions of Sweden. The trees rose tall and silent around them, their branches filtering the late summer light into long, quiet beams. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Nights were cool and heavy with the calls of distant owls. Travel was slow. Harald's wound demanded it. Sometimes the men built simple litters from branches to carry him, weaving together birch limbs and rope. Other times he walked, leaning on a staff, his jaw set with a stubborn strength that would one day make him famous. Days blended into one another in the forest. Footsteps softened against moss-covered ground. Streams ran clear and cold between stones smoothed by centuries. There were moments when the world felt gentle, as though offering small pockets of peace to ease the weight of their loss. Eventually, the forest path brought them to the lands of the Sphere. People who looked toward the east and south for trade, who knew well the routes that led along riverways deep into Europe. It was here Harald learned of a place called Gardariki, known today as Kievan Rus. A land of wooden fortresses, winding rivers, bustling markets, and princes whose influence reached across continents. A place where warriors from the north could find work, sometimes as traders, sometimes as guards, sometimes as mercenaries. And so, following the great river routes, Harald and his men travelled south. The rivers were their roads. Long, narrow boats carried them gently downstream, water lapping softly against the hulls. Tall grasses swayed along the banks. Forests opened into plains, then narrowed again into wooded channels where the canopy filtered the sky into a mosaic of green and gold. As the days passed, Harald felt his strength slowly return. The wound in his leg stiffened in the mornings, but loosened with movement. Pain became a companion, but not a hindrance. He watched the world flow by, the herons stepping softly through the shallows, the distant farms where smoke rose from simple hearths, the silhouettes of traders steering their boats with long poles. Each night, the men made camp along the water's edge. They cooked simple meals over small fires, dried fish, barley porridge, bread baked on flat stones. Sometimes they spoke of home, sometimes of Olaf, and sometimes they simply listened to the quiet ripple of the river under the moon. Weeks later, the towers of Novgorod rose before them. Tall wooden walls, steep roofs, and bustling docks filled with the sounds of horses, merchants, and distant bells. Novgorod was unlike anything Harald had known. Here, traders from Scandinavia mingled with merchants from the east, speaking languages that wove together like threads in a vast tapestry. Furs, iron, honey, wax, and silver passed through the markets. Caravans arrived from distant lands, and at the center of it all stood Prince Yaroslav, known to history as Yaroslav the Wise. Harald presented himself and his small band of loyal men before the prince. And though he was young, Yaroslav saw something in him, a sharpness of mind, a strength of spirit, a future carved in the lines of his face. Yaroslav welcomed Harald, not merely as a wanderer, but as a guest of importance. In time, Harald entered his service, rising quickly through the ranks of the prince's warriors. He learned new languages, studied new customs, and adapted to a world far larger than the valleys of Norway. He fought alongside seasoned soldiers, defended trade routes, and escorted caravans along the long stretches of wooded terrain that connected the north to the Black Sea. He proved himself resourceful, calm under pressure, and unyielding, qualities that did not go unnoticed. But Harald's ambition did not end in Novgorod. He listened to travelers who spoke of a distant empire, a place of unimaginable wealth, towering walls, and a city that shone with gold in the midday sun. They called it Miklagarth, the great city, Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. For a young man shaped by defeat and driven by resolve, the great city offered something he could not ignore: opportunity, adventure, a chance to build the kind of reputation that could one day shake kingdoms. And so, when the time was right, Harald Hardrada prepared to leave Novgorod behind, to journey even farther from home, down the long rivers that would carry him south through forests, plains, and ancient trade routes, toward the greatest empire of the medieval world, and a destiny he had only begun to imagine. From the wooden walls of Novgorod, Harald Hardrada's path curved southward again, following the long river routes that linked the northern forests to the wider world. The land changed slowly as the days passed, the air warming, the forests thinning, the rivers broadening into wide, slow-moving currents that mirrored the sky. It was a journey as old as the traders who had linked Scandinavia with the lands of the East, a route of boats portaged over muddy ground, of carts pulled by patient oxen, of villages clustered along the water where families had lived for generations. For Harald, it was another step away from the sorrow of Stiklestad, and another step toward becoming someone new. By the time he reached Kiev, the capital of Yaroslav's realm, the world around him felt both familiar and foreign. The city rose on gentle hills above the Dnieper River, its wooden fortifications glowing honey-brown in the late afternoon sun. Topped with bright roofs and crossed by bustling roads, Kiev was a tapestry of movement. Horsemen riding along sandy paths, merchants calling out their wares, the soft sound of church bells drifting through the warm air. There were markets filled with spices from the south, glass and fine cloth from the Mediterranean, furs stacked in neat piles, and coins stamped with the marks of distant emperors. It was a crossroads of cultures, each voice adding to the hum of life that filled the streets. Harald lived there for a time, long enough to heal, long enough to grow stronger, long enough to observe how wealth and power flowed in a land far larger than the one he left behind. Yaroslav entrusted him with duties that required not only strength but judgment, and Harald, eager to prove himself, learned quickly. Yet even as he settled into this new rhythm, he felt the pull of something beyond. Travelers arriving from the Black Sea spoke of a place unlike any other, a city of marble and gold, built where continents touched, where the domes of churches glittered like morning light on water, and where emperors ruled from thrones said to be carved from ivory. Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. To a young warrior from Norway, the tales of Miklagartha sounded like something from a dream. But dreams for Harald were not things to admire from afar. They were things to pursue. He gathered a band of followers, those who had joined him in Novgorod, those who trusted him, those who sensed in him a rising star. Together, they prepared to journey south, following the great river that wound like a silver thread across the landscape. The descent of the Dnieper was a journey both beautiful and difficult. Sections of the river ran smooth and quiet, reflecting clouds drifting lazily across the sky. Other sections were broken by rapids, places where the water roared between rocks polished by centuries of current. At these points, the men had to carry their longboats overland, lifting them onto shoulders or dragging them slowly over wooden rollers laid carefully on the ground. The riverbanks were alive with life, herons lifting into flight, foxes slipping between the trees, willows bending their branches low over the water. Villages appeared now and then, smoke rising softly from chimneys as women baked bread and children ran barefoot along well-worn paths. Harald watched everything with quiet attentiveness. The further south they travelled, the more the world opened up, revealing a tapestry of people and customs unlike those of the north. At night, they camped near the river's edge, building small fires and sharing simple meals. Harald would sometimes sit apart, looking into the flames with the thoughtful stillness of someone carrying both memories and ambitions. He remembered Olaf, the weight of that loss, the road he had taken since. And he thought of what lay ahead, a city where warriors from distant lands could earn wealth and honor, where reputation could grow like a banner unfurled in the bright wind. Eventually, the river widened into a broad expanse that shimmered beneath the light. The air grew warmer. Birdsong changed to the calls of southern cranes and plovers, and the horizon stretched out until it met the waters of the Black Sea. The sea was vast, a restless mirror of blues and greys that seemed to touch the edge of the world. Harald and his men secured passage on merchant ships heading towards the Bosporus, joining traders who carried grain, honey, wax, and timber to the markets of Byzantium. The voyage across the sea was calm. Waves whispered against the sides of the ships, and gulls circled overhead. Harald spent long hours on the deck, watching the horizon slowly shift, feeling the wind carry the faint scent of lands he did not yet know. Days later, As the sun rose over the water, the outline of a great city appeared. Towers and domes catching the dawn, walls stretching along the shore, roofs glowing like embers under the morning light. Harald had reached Constantinople. The city was larger than any place he had ever imagined. Ships from every corner of the known world clustered in its harbours. Markets overflowed with goods and voices of countless languages. And high above it all shone the great dome of the Hagia Sophia, rising like a sunrise carved in stone. Everything in Harald's life had been preparing him for this moment. The fall at Stiklestad, the journey through Sweden and Novgorod, the long rivers and the open sea. Here, in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, he would become something more than a wandering exile. He would become a warrior of the Varangian Guard, a defender of emperors, a man whose name would echo in halls far from home. And though he did not yet know it, his legend was only just beginning. The first thing Harald Hardrada noticed upon entering Constantinople was the light. It moved differently here, shimmering across marble courtyards, sliding gently over mosaics of gold and glass, settling softly on domes that curved toward the sky. Where Norway's light was sharp and clean, shaped by mountains and cold air, the light of Byzantium was warm, like sunlight seen through amber. The city itself was alive with motion. Horses clattered along stone roads. Merchants called out in languages Harald had never heard. Soldiers marched in polished armor that reflected the sun like water. And through it all drifted the scent of spices, cinnamon, frankincense, and pepper carried from distant markets of the east. For a young man who had crossed half the known world, it was a place almost too wondrous to comprehend. But Harald had not come merely to admire it. He had come to join the most feared and respected military force in the empire, the Varangian Guard. The Varangians were warriors from the north, men of Scandinavia, Rus, and beyond, who served as elite bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. They were chosen for their strength, their loyalty, and their unyielding discipline. In a court filled with shifting alliances and whispered intrigues, the emperor trusted these foreign soldiers because they owed their allegiance not to any noble family, but to him alone. Harald, tall and broad-shouldered even in youth, presented himself to the officers who oversaw recruitment. His bearing was confident but respectful, his gaze steady. And though he was still only in his late teens, he carried himself like a man who had already lived a lifetime. They examined his weapons, asked of his travels, listened as he described Stiklestad with calm precision. And when they looked into his eyes, they saw what countless others would later recognize: a fierce determination, sharpened not by pride, but by purpose. Harald was accepted. His training began almost immediately. The Varangian Guard was unlike any force in Europe. Their armor gleamed with Byzantine craftsmanship, scale and lavallar patterns that moved with the body like flowing metal. Their axes were long-handled and broad-bladed, capable of cleaving armor with frightening ease, and their discipline was absolute. Harald woke each morning to the muted calls of officers echoing through the barracks. Training began before sunrise. Men practiced long marches through the narrow streets of the city, drilled with shields and axes, learned formation work that relied not on individual strength, but on seamless coordination. Harald, with his height and natural power, adapted quickly. Months passed, and he developed a reputation for endurance, the warrior who never tired, who never complained, who carried out every command with calm focus. And yet, life in the Varangian Guard was not only training. The Guard was often called upon to escort imperial caravans, to guard the gates of the palace, to stand watch within the great halls where mosaics glittered under oil lamps. Harald learned the subtleties of court life, how nobles spoke in careful turns, how officials measured each word like a jewel weighed in a merchant's palm, how power shifted and flowed just beneath the surface of polite conversation. All the while, Constantinople surrounded him with its beauty. Mornings filled with the low chant of priests in the Hagia Sophia. Afternoons where sunlight softened across the Bosporus. Evenings where lanterns flickered along harbours crowded with ships from 3 continents. For Harald, a man shaped by the cold fjords of Norway, this city felt like the beating heart of the world. And yet, the empire did not always know peace. Harald soon found himself marching beneath the sun of lands far from Byzantium. The Varangian Guard was deployed to regions that needed the emperor's strength. He fought in Sicily, where the sea glimmered blue beneath cliffs that rose sharply from the shore. There, Harald learned the rhythms of southern warfare, the heat pressing down on armor, the cries of soldiers echoing through ancient ruins, the dust rising beneath the feet of advancing lines. He fought in the eastern Mediterranean, where Byzantine ships cut through the water like dark blades. The sea breezes carried the scent of salt and the calls of foreign birds, and Harald, often standing at the prow of a vessel, felt the pool of adventure deepen within him. He fought in the Balkan campaigns, moving through dense forests and winding passes, where the air hung thick with the calls of unseen animals. He learned to navigate unfamiliar terrain, to read enemy movements, to remain steady in the face of unpredictable dangers. And through all of this, Harald earned something more valuable than silver or gold. He earned respect. Officers began to seek his counsel. He was entrusted with commands, and stories of his bravery, told in quiet tones around evening fires, began to spread through the ranks. One tale described Harald lifting a wounded fellow soldier and carrying him across the battlefield, despite arrows falling around them. Another spoke of how he held a defensive line against overwhelming odds, refusing to retreat until every man behind him had escaped to safety. Whether all these stories were true, or whether some grew taller in the telling, mattered little. What mattered was that Harald's reputation rose like the morning sun. In time, his service brought him wealth, not only the pay of a soldier, but rewards earned from campaigns, tributes, and gifts. He sent some of his riches back to Prince Yaroslav in Kiev, honoring the man who had sheltered him. He saved the rest, knowing that wealth had a purpose waiting in the future. But despite the glory, the campaigns, the respect, Harald never forgot the land that lay far to the north. On quiet nights, sitting beneath the silence of foreign stars, he would remember Norway, the silvered surface of winter lakes, the low murmur of pine forests, the voice of his brother calling men to battle. He had travelled far, gained much, but deep within him, a seed of longing remained. He was no longer a wounded boy carried from a battlefield. He had become something sharper, stronger, more certain. A warrior forged not only by loss, but by distance, by time, by the shaping hands of fate. And soon, the path ahead would turn again. For Harald Hardrada had not forgotten his homeland, and Norway, though quiet now, would one day feel the echo of his return. Years passed as Harald Hardrada served in the glittering world of Byzantium. He had marched across islands warmed by southern winds, sailed seas bright as polished steel, and walked beneath domes that glowed like small suns. He had earned wealth, honor, scars, and stories, each one carried quietly, like stones placed carefully into a traveler's pack. But even the greatest cities do not hold a man forever. There comes a time when the road home begins to whisper, and for Harald, that whisper grew stronger with every campaign he survived. He was no longer the young man who had limped from Stiklestad with a wounded leg and the taste of defeat heavy in his mouth. He had become something far different, a seasoned commander, a leader of men, a warrior known across the empire for his discipline and skill. And so, with his name respected, his coffers full, and his purpose sharpened, Harald made a quiet decision. He would return to the north. He would return to Norway. He gathered the riches he had earned, silver coins stamped with imperial insignia, fine cloth from distant workshops, jewelry crafted by Byzantine artisans. These were not luxuries to Harald. They were tools, resources, means to build alliances and shape futures. When the time came, he left Constantinople without spectacle. No parade, no fanfare, just a man stepping onto a ship and watching the city's golden roofs fade slowly into the warm horizon. The voyage northward was long but peaceful. Waves rocked the vessel gently. Winds carried the scent of open sea and the distant promise of colder shores. Harald spent many days standing at the ship's railing, eyes set on the horizon, mind steady and quiet. Eventually, the warm air of the Mediterranean gave way to the cooler breezes of the Black Sea, then to the river currents that wound back toward Kiev. When Harald reached the city, Prince Yaroslav welcomed him not as a returning wanderer, but as a man of great stature and accomplishment. In the years since Harald had left, Yaroslav's influence had grown even stronger. He ruled with patience, wisdom, and an eye toward alliances that stretched far beyond his borders. Under his guidance, Kiev had become a center of culture and learning, its markets filled with merchants from every direction. Harald spent a season there, resting, reflecting, and preparing for the final leg of his journey. The prince treated him with great honor, and Harald, in turn, showed deep respect to the man who had once sheltered him when he fled from Norway with nothing but a wound and a handful of loyal companions. Before Harald departed, Yaroslav gave him something more valuable than silver or fine goods. He gave him connections, allies, a network of support that reached into the courts of Scandinavia. Harald then set out for the north, traveling through forests alive with the quiet music of wind in the branches. He followed old trade routes where the earth was worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. He crossed rivers that reflected the pale sky, their surfaces broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing fish. Day by day, the air grew colder. The nights sharpened. The northern world revealed itself again. Great pines rising like pillars, fjords gleaming beneath grey clouds, and mountains standing silent and watchful. At last, Harald reached the edges of the land he had left as a wounded youth. Norway. It had changed, as all lands do over the span of years. New leaders had risen. Old feuds had cooled, while others had ignited. The country was steadier now, shaped by shifting alliances and the steady weight of time. But Harald had changed even more. He arrived not as a defeated supporter of a fallen king, but as a man of immense wealth, seasoned skill, and undeniable presence. A man whose travels had carved away uncertainty and replaced it with quiet confidence. People who saw him were struck by his appearance. He was tall, taller than most men of the north. broad of shoulder, calm of expression. His gaze carried both distance and focus, as though he were always measuring paths seen and unseen. He did not rush. He did not roar his intentions. He simply moved with the steady certainty of someone who understood that time was an ally, not an enemy. Word of his return spread slowly at first, then quickly, carried along the fjords by traders and fishermen, whispered in long houses where fires burned low at night. Stories of Harold's service in Byzantium grew with every telling, some true, some embellished, all painting a picture of a man who had become larger than life. And soon, Norway's rulers began to wonder not just why Harald had returned, but what he planned to do next. For a land that remembered Olaf Haraldsson with reverence, his brother's arrival carried weight. People wondered if Harald sought his brother's crown, if he came to reclaim something lost, or if he had simply returned to look upon his homeland once more. Harald did not reveal everything at once. He met with chieftains, shared meals, listened more than he spoke, watched the shape of the land's politics with the practiced eye of someone who had walked through the courts of emperors. Quietly, patiently, he began to build alliances, with those who remembered Olaf's rule, with those who saw strength in Harald's presence, and with those who understood that Norway might once again be shaped by the hands of a single, determined leader. The land had been waiting, though it did not yet know it, waiting for someone who could unite its scattered territories, calm its lingering tensions, and stand strong against outside threats. Waiting for someone like Harald Hardrada, the man who had walked through battles, palaces, deserts and seas, and returned home with a heart unbroken and a purpose undimmed. Here in the cold and rugged north, the next chapter of his life would unfold. Not as a soldier of Byzantium, not as an exile seeking shelter, but as a man shaped by distance and destiny, returning to claim the place that had always waited for him. Harald Hardrada's return to Norway did not go unnoticed. His presence alone carried the weight of distant empires, of gold earned in foreign wars, of scars hidden beneath armor polished by Byzantine craftsmen, of a reputation whispered in the halls of princes. And though he moved quietly at first, the land around him shifted in subtle ways, like the first tremors before the deep roll of thunder. Norway, in the years since Olaf's fall, had lived under the rule of men who walked carefully along the line between power and influence. There were rivalries among chieftains, disagreements born from old loyalties and new ambitions. But Harald, watching these currents with a steady gaze, recognized something important. The land was ready for a king who could unify it, a king with strength, a king with wealth, a king whose life had carved him into something unmovable. In time, Harald stepped forward as that man, supported by allies, resources, and the respect he had earned abroad. He claimed the throne of Norway. And he did so not with reckless force, but with the calm assurance of one who understands the responsibilities of leadership. As king, Harald was firm, sometimes stern, often strategic. He brought order to regions long accustomed to settling disputes through old customs and shifting alliances. He strengthened defenses, organized trade, and shaped Norway into a land capable of standing against its neighbors. Under his rule, the kingdom grew more stable, more unified, more defined. But Harald Hardrada was not a man shaped solely for peace. He was a wanderer, a warrior, someone whose destiny stretched far beyond the narrow fjords of his homeland. And in the quiet moments of his reign, another thought began to form, a thought that traveled across the sea like a faint echo. England. For many years, the English throne had been a source of tension and opportunity for Scandinavian rulers. The ties between the two lands were old, woven through generations of trade, conflict, and settlement. Norse kings had ruled parts of England before. Some believed they still held rightful claims. Harald listened carefully to the stories carried by traders and envoys. He heard of disputes, rivalries, uncertain successions. And within those shifting sands, he saw something familiar, a path toward opportunity. His claim to the English crown came through family ties and political agreements forged long before he was born. Some argued that promises had been made to his nephew Magnus, and by extension to Harald himself. Others said the English king, Edward the Confessor, had hinted at foreign support. Whatever the truth, Harald understood something fundamental. Claims mattered less than conviction, less than strength, less than the willingness to act when the moment arose. And Harald was a man who acted. Still, his ambition was patient. Years passed as he ruled Norway with a steady hand, gathering wealth from trade, strengthening the navy, and surrounding himself with skilled warriors, men who had followed him across seas and through kingdoms. They trusted him, and Harald trusted that when the time came, they would sail with him again. He was not reckless, though. He watched the situation in England with the calm, measuring gaze of a man who had seen empires rise and fall. Edward the Confessor's health was uncertain. Questions of succession swirled like mist around the English court. And across the sea, various nobles and foreign rulers prepared themselves for what might come. Among them was another Harald, Harald Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, whose influence reached into every corner of the English realm. Their names would one day be forever linked. But for now, they were two men circling the same throne, each guided by ambition, each shaped by the world that raised him. Slowly, quietly, the pieces fell into place. Harald Hardrada began assembling a fleet, long ships carved from tall, straight trees, fitted with sails made from wool dyed deep red or blue, their hulls sturdy enough to cross wide seas. The sound of axes echoed through forests. Men shaped beams, hammered iron rivets, and wove rope from strong northern fibers. Villagers along the coast watched the preparations with curiosity and awe. The king said little of his intentions, but everyone understood that the sea would soon carry them somewhere far from home. In the evenings, Harald sometimes walked along the shoreline, boots sinking softly into damp sand. He would look out at the horizon, where the line between sea and sky blurred into a gentle haze. The wind carried the scent of salt and distant places, and Harald, standing tall against the shifting light, felt the silent pull of destiny. England was a land of farms and rolling hills, of stone churches and wooden halls, of bustling markets and quiet villages. But it was also a land caught between rival claims, a place where one decisive hand could change everything. Harald Hardrada believed that hand could be his. He was older now, but no less fierce, no less determined, no less shaped by the long road that had carried him from the moment he was carried wounded off the field at Stiklestad. He had risen in Byzantium, commanded armies, earned treasure, and returned home as a king. Now he looked across the sea, toward a throne that seemed to shimmer like distant gold. The ambition that formed in him was not rash. It was the quiet kind, the kind carried patiently like a secret stone held close to the heart. the kind that waits for the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment was approaching, carried on the tide, stirred by whispers, woven through the restless wind. Soon, Harald Hardrada would set sail for England. But before that voyage began, the world around him would shift once more, shaping the path that awaited him across the sea. The summer of 1066 unfolded quietly across the northern shores of Scandinavia. Long days of soft light, slow waves brushing against the keels of ships, fishermen calling across calm waters. But beneath this peaceful surface, Harald Hardrada was preparing for a voyage that would define the final chapter of his life. His fleet gathered along the coast like a forest of carved prows rising from the sea. Long ships lined the shoreline, sleek, narrow vessels shaped by skilled hands, their hulls strengthened for the open water. Shields hung along the sides in neat rows, their circular forms catching the early light. Sails, folded neatly, bore colours that would soon stretch against the wind like the wings of great seabirds. Warriors arrived from across Norway, men hardened by winters of training and summers of sea travel. They came with axes, spears, and round shields painted in bold designs. Some brought small amulets carved from bone or wood, symbols of protection or luck. Others carried memories of kin lost in battles long past. Harald watched them gather with a calm that betrayed none of the weight he carried. He had been many things in his life: exile, wanderer, soldier, commander, king. But now he stood on the threshold of something larger. A final test, a final claim, a final chance to shape the world in the way he believed it should be. When the time came, the ships pushed away from the shore with long, powerful strokes. The sea opened before them, its surface rippling gently in the early morning light. Sails unfurled, catching the wind, swelling softly as the fleet moved toward the horizon. The voyage to England was calm. The ships drifted beneath wide skies, where sunlight danced across the water in quiet patterns. Harald often stood near the prow, the wind stirring his hair, his gaze fixed on the distance. He was older now, broad-shouldered and powerful, but with lines of experience deepening his expression. Still, his eyes held the same quiet determination that had carried him across continents. When the fleet reached the English coast, they landed near the mouth of the Humber River. The air was cooler, touched by the scent of distant fields and the faint smoke of farming villages. Harald and his men moved inland, following paths that wound gently through rolling countryside. The land here was softer than Norway, hills like sleeping animals under blankets of green grass, narrow streams gliding through meadows, small churches rising from quiet settlements. Harald's army met little resistance at first. The English king, Harald Godwinson, was occupied in the south, watching for another threat. So the northern towns surrendered quickly or agreed to terms. It was said that Harald Hardrada moved with a steady calm, offering fair conditions to those who yielded, making clear that he sought not destruction, but the recognition of his claim. Soon after landing, Harald received word that the local earls, Morcar of Northumbria and his brother Edwin of Mercia, were gathering an army. But even this force could not halt his advance. At the Battle of Fulford, Harald's seasoned warriors overcame the defenders, pushing them back with disciplined formations and practiced strength. For a brief moment, the path to the north seemed open. The city of York, recognizing the strength of Harald's army, offered terms of surrender. Arrangements were made for hostages, agreements negotiated, and a meeting set outside the city walls near a place called Stamford Bridge. The morning of the meeting was bright and warm, the air touched with the last gentle breath of summer. Harold's men, believing the greatest danger had passed, left much of their armor at their ships. They marched lightly, carrying shields and weapons, but without the heavy mail that protected them in battle. As they approached Stamford Bridge, the landscape opened wide. A shallow river wound lazily across the fields. Wildflowers brushed against their boots. The bridge itself arched over the water, simple, wooden, unassuming. But across the field, something unexpected stirred. A line of soldiers appeared on the horizon, shields glinting, standards rising, dust forming beneath their feet. They marched with purpose, with speed, with the kind of urgency that speaks of a force arriving after a long and grueling journey. Harald Hardrada understood immediately. Harold Godwinson had come. He had marched his army north with astonishing swiftness, more than 180 miles in just a few days, driven by the need to protect his kingdom. The quiet field, with its gentle river and late summer breeze, shifted in that moment. What had been a place of parley became a place of battle. Harald Hardrada moved among his men with steady composure, calling for shields, forming lines, preparing as best they could without their armor. There was no panic, only readiness. The warriors of Norway had faced danger before, and they faced this with the same calm resilience.
The English advanced with disciplined steps. Their shield wall formed smoothly, a line of wood and iron stretching across the field. Behind it came archers, their bows curved like crescents of pale wood. Harald Hardrada stepped to the front of his line, tall, unarmored, a blue cloak stirring in the wind. In his hands, he carried a great two-handed sword, broad, gleaming, tempered in distant lands. He sang, not loudly, not fiercely, but with the steady voice of a man who had spent his life carrying the weight of expectation. It was said he sang old verses of the North, poetry woven into his very identity. And when the English advanced, the battle erupted. The clash of shields, the low thud of bodies colliding, the quiet sound of Harold's boots on soft earth as he stepped forward again and again. His sword rose and fell with calm precision, like a man who had lived his life in training for this moment. For hours the fighting continued. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. The river glimmered as though unaware of the struggle beside it. Harald Hardrada surged forward, leading with the same unwavering courage he had shown at Stiklestad so many years earlier. But even the strongest man cannot outrun every danger. An arrow found him. It struck beneath his throat, passing through the vulnerable part of his neck left exposed without armor. He fell where he stood, a tall figure collapsing slowly, like a great pine tree swaying once before touching the ground. Around him, his men fought on with fierce loyalty, but the weight of the day shifted. Leadership changed hands. Lines faltered. The battle, once poised between two claims, curved decisively toward one. And so, Harald Hardrada, the wanderer, the warrior, the king, the last great Viking, met his end on a quiet English field, beneath a warm and indifferent sky. There was no storm, no roaring wind, no thunder to mark the moment. Only the soft breeze moving across late summer grass, and the river flowing gently beneath Stamford Bridge. A life that had crossed continents came to rest there, far from the fjords of his childhood, far from the domes of Byzantium,
far from the home he had once left, wounded and uncertain. Yet even in death, his story did not fade. Harald Hardrada's name would be spoken for centuries. His life would grow into legend. And the memory of the king who refused to yield, who crossed the world in pursuit of destiny, would continue to echo long after the battle's end.
When the sun dipped low on that late September day at Stamford Bridge, the battlefield settled into stillness. Shadows lengthened over the grass. The river moved quietly beneath the wooden arch of the bridge, and the sounds of battle faded into the soft murmur of wind brushing across the English fields. Harald Hardrada, who had crossed oceans and kingdoms, now lay among the fallen. His warriors, those who survived, gathered around him with reverence, with sorrow, and with the quiet understanding that a great man's journey had reached its end. News of the battle spread quickly through the land. To the English, it was a moment of relief. One threat repelled, one challenger turned aside. But to the north, to the fjords of Norway, to the homes of those who had followed Harald's rise, word of his death rippled like a cold wind. Some heard of it in longhouses where fires burned low. Others learned of it from traders arriving in distant harbours. And in each place, the reaction was the same: a moment of stillness, a quiet breath, a feeling like a heavy stone settling gently into the bottom of a deep pool. For Harald was not merely a king. He was the embodiment of an age, a living echo of the Viking world, a bridge between the old ways and the emerging shape of medieval Europe. His life had carried him across the full arc of that transformation. As a boy, he had fought in shield walls formed in the ancient style, close, raw, and rooted in traditions as old as the sagas themselves. As a young man, he had served in the halls of princes, walked beneath the golden mosaics of Constantinople, and commanded forces that spanned cultures and continents. As a king, he had worked to shape Norway into a unified realm, strengthening its laws, its defences, and its standing among neighbouring kingdoms. And as a leader marching toward England, he carried a claim that stretched back through generations, touching upon the long, complicated ties between Scandinavia and the British Isles. His story was not one of simple ambition. It was a story of resilience, a life shaped by losses, by exile, by determination, and by the refusal to let circumstances define him. Many years after his death, poets and storytellers kept his memory alive. They spoke of his bravery, his travels, his victories, and even his flaws. His deeds grew taller with each retelling, as legends often do. His sword sockets stronger, his voice louder, his presence larger. But beneath these embellishments lay a quieter truth. Harald Hardrada was a man who lived fully, with conviction, with courage, with a willingness to face whatever paths opened before him. He crossed deserts where the sand glowed beneath a burning sun. He sailed seas that shimmered under starlit nights. He marched through forests, plains, and mountains, each step moving him farther from the boy he once was. And yet, some part of him always remained connected to home, to the cold lakes, to the mountain air, to the stories told beside northern fires. It is said that after the battle, Harald's body was eventually returned to Norway. The journey took time, moving through rivers and seas he had once travelled in life, but finally he came home. There, he was laid to rest in the land of his birth, surrounded by the landscapes that had shaped him. And with his passing, an age quietly ended. The Viking world, bold, adventurous, untamed, had been fading for decades,
shifting into a new era of kingdoms, alliances, and emerging identities. Harold's death at Stamford Bridge marked, for many, the symbolic close of that chapter. Not with a roar, not with a storm, but with a gentle quiet settling over a field beneath a warm and untroubled sky. In the centuries that followed, Harold's story endured. He became the subject of sagas, historical chronicles, and whispered tales in winter halls. Children heard of his bravery, warriors heard of his feats, kings heard of his judgments and his journeys. And even now, as the world continues to turn, his life remains one of the most remarkable arcs in medieval history. A tale of a man who refused to yield, who refused to fade, who refused to die quietly into obscurity. A man who carried the spirit of his people across continents, who rose from exile to command empires, and who met his end with the same unshakable resolve with which he had lived. His legacy is not only in the battles he fought or the crowns he sought. It is in the way his life reminds us that resilience can shape destinies, that courage can carve new paths, and that some stories continue to echo long after the final page is turned. And so the tale of Harald Hardrada settles softly into memory. A story carried by time, held by history, and whispered like a distant song across the quiet northern winds.
The sounds of battle have faded, the longships have come to rest, and the winding paths that carried him across continents have finally settled beneath the soft weight of time. As his story falls quiet, allow yourself to settle as well. Let the rise and fall of your breath steady. Let the thoughts of the day loosen one by one, like knots untied by gentle hands. And let the stillness of the moment wrap around you like a warm cloak. You have walked through distant lands, across forests, across seas, across the quiet fields of long-forgotten ages. Now those places grow dim, like lanterns slowly fading in the distance. What remains is peace. If sleep has not already found you, it soon will. There is no need to chase it. Just breathe, softly, slowly, and let the quiet guide you downward. The night is calm, the world is gentle, and there is nothing you need to do now, nothing to worry about, nothing to carry forward, except to rest. Let your mind drift like a ship on still water. Let your thoughts become soft, quiet shapes. Let the rhythm of the night settle into your bones. And as you close your eyes, as the last edges of the waking world begin to blur, know that you are safe. You are calm. You are at ease. This story has reached its end. Yours for tonight is just beginning. Rest now. Sleep well. And may your dreams be peaceful.